Hello, I'm Robert, volunteer fact checker and helping you if you're scared of many things. And this is about what Trump might announce tomorrow, 14th of July 2025, on Monday. I'm saying that so that you can tell right from the start, if you watch this video after that date, that this whole video is about something that hasn't happened, that didn't happen, this claim. So what he is likely to do is to, if he does announce anything, is announce something about sanctions and sanctioning Russia. He only said he could, he didn't say he would. But that's the obvious thing, that he's been, at the time of doing this video, Trump has been talking with Lindsey Graham, who is putting forward a sanctions bill in Senate. And this is coming to a head, and he might well be able to get it passed in the Senate at least, and possibly in the House as well, at the beginning of next week. It's possible. So that would be a very obvious thing for him to announce. It's the only thing really that, another thing that's on the go right now is that a possible arrangement of the United States to sell military assistance to Ukraine. That means that European allies pay the United States for military equipment to send to Ukraine. It used to be the United States was paying for it. Now the United States has stepped out of all this. And in 2022, the United States was doing a lot of paying. By 2023-24, it was equal United States and Europe. Now Trump wants it to be entirely Europe that pays for it. He's got $4 billion of presidential drawdown authority from Biden, and then the rest of it, he wants Europe to pay the United States for help to Ukraine, or Ukraine to buy it itself. So that's Trump's approach at the moment. So then it could be that it's going to sell. Another possibility is exchange military equipment for rights for minerals under the minerals deal, which means that the United States gives military equipment to Ukraine, and Ukraine in return gives rights to American companies to develop mineral companies in Ukraine, which would benefit the Ukrainian economy, would also benefit the United States and give the United States access to those minerals. So that's what Trump is hinting at. And then I get people saying, but look, if Trump helps Ukraine to defend itself, surely Putin will get very, very angry, won't he? And if he gets very, very angry, then that means that he could do anything. Well, I simulated being angry there. I wasn't angry. Actors can act being angry. Putin has been, and I'm not an actor, you think about all the movies you've looked at where actors have been angry. And you think that they lost impulse control in those movies? Not for a moment. So most kids learn impulse control aged 3 to 4. There's some people who, for various reasons, can't learn it even as an adult. Someone like that would not become a leader of a country. They'd be completely disqualified from that. So if you don't have the ability to master impulse control and you're an adult, you're not going to become a leader of a country. And Putin, he is an ex-KGB spy. He has extraordinarily high levels of impulse control. And to show how high his impulse control is, he made the decision to invade Ukraine probably in 2020, certainly before the military maneuvers in 2021. And yet, he simulated someone who is very keen on peace in Ukraine and who would never invade Ukraine so convincingly that President Macron, who is, as a president, would surely be very good at reading body language, he never detected that Putin had actually all along was just stringing him along and planned to invade Ukraine, and made the plans possibly as early as 2020, certainly before the invasion in 2021. And Macron, I mean, you can see his face if you look at the video. There's actually the video of when he heard from Zelensky the news. Russia has started all-out war. It invaded from the north, from the east, and from the south, all on the 24th of February 2022. So Russia has been at all-out war with Ukraine since that day. And so Putin is already doing everything he can in Ukraine. And it doesn't matter how angry he gets. If he does get angry, it won't make the slightest bit of difference. He knows very well that he can't do anything. So if the United States helps Ukraine to protect itself against these drones, for instance, which are bombing the Ukrainian cities of no military value except using up the Ukrainian air defenses. If Ukraine gets more air defenses so it can shoot down these drones more easily, then that is going to reduce the risk to Ukraine civilians. That is not going to help Russia to take over Ukraine. Can you see that? And if the United States helps Ukraine to be able to fight back more easily along the front line with Russia, that will stop Russia from advancing. It will not help Russia to advance into Ukraine if the United States gives Ukraine the ability to stop them. The whole idea is utterly ludicrous. There's no way that by helping Ukraine to defend itself, that the United States could make it easier for Russia to invade Ukraine. It makes no sense whatsoever. And then the idea that Putin would attack NATO because he can't win in Ukraine. I mean, can you see how ludicrous that is? Bearing in mind that he's not someone's going to act out of emotion, he's extremely risk averse. He does not do anything without checking it and double checking it for weeks and months in advance. That's the Institute of Study of War. Anyone who looks at it carefully, they all say that. Then how is he going to think that attacking NATO would help him to invade Ukraine? Again, try thinking about that. If he were to even do a small attack, try to take over Estonia, say, or to try to take over the city of Narva in Estonia, and even if it was just quickly rebelled in a few days, then that would give Ukraine's NATO allies lots and lots of incentive to give Ukraine lots more material to defend itself against Russia. It's not going to help Russia to gain ground in Ukraine. And it distracts away from whatever he's doing there. So no, there's no way that Putin is going to do that. I'll go into that a bit more later in this. So now, let's talk about the false analogy with the strike on Fordo. So remember that Trump told his followers he's not going to start any wars. So he had run into quite a lot of difficulty with his own followers because he did this military strike in Iran. But he managed to get out of that by saying, look, I ended that war. That's what I'm here to do, is to end wars. I'm not starting wars like other presidents do. So this is why they were, first why they were legal, and also why he didn't go against his promise. So it was requested by Israel. Israel had complete air control over Iran for 11 days. So there was no risk to the US of the bombers. A clear military target, which was the target that actually the B-2 bombers had been practicing and developed their biggest bombs for, designed for it. Iran had no possibility of any of its missiles hitting the United States, despite what the sensationalist press implied, which was utter nonsense. No risk to civilians for the Fordo strikes. The strike ended the war. The media reports were discussing it throughout the war, whether the United States would get involved. And he would develop the strikes on Fordo in careful consultation with generals that sign off the plan. And he did not announce them in advance. It makes no sense whatsoever to announce military strikes in advance. And Trump has never done any military strike, any military action that goes against the law of war. So here's some numerous previous wars. Look at them all. They all started, and I've got links to them there. So there's the Korean War is the first of all. That was not authorized by Congress. Or the first Iraq War, or the invasion of Cuba, or the Vietnam War, or Cambodia, Dominican Republic, Lebanon, but then Grenada and Panama, Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan War, the Iraq. The second Iraq War is the only one in this list that was authorized by Congress. Libya intervention by Barack Obama, Trump's Syria strikes. None of those were ever authorized by Congress. So it turns out that Biden is the only president since Jimmy Carter who did not do something like this. So Trump got a lot of political criticism from his own side simply because he ran on an election campaign of never starting any wars. It was not really because he did anything unusual compared with previous presidents. Indeed, what he did was very restrained compared to all of these, really, except his chemical weapons strike on Syria was almost as clean, but not really. This was by far of all in that entire list the least risk to civilians, because the chemical weapons factory, there was risk to civilians there. There was no risk. And he stopped a 12-day conflict, which he didn't do with the Syria airstrikes. So, arguably, he did keep that promise. So now I want to talk about why a general would immediately veto a plan to attack Russia or deliberately start a war with Russia. And it's not just for Monday, this is for generally. So all this is something that is just a general thing. So hopefully once you understand this, you'll be inoculated against any of these false claims going forwards. So this is because of the law of war. So Trump, as a civilian, he is not going to be thoroughly trained in the law of war, and he may or not respect it. That does not matter. He orders generals, and a general will be thoroughly versed in them. And as Brian McKeown said, 4-star generals are not shrinking violets. That's a British term for someone who says, "Oh yes, I'll do what you say. I'm not going to question anything you say." Someone just doesn't fight back at all and just does whatever they're told. But a 4-star general is not going to get to being a general who is looking after lower generals below them and commanders and officers and entire branches of the military if he's a shrinking violet. He's going to be very, very strong in commanding. And he is going to be very, very strongly saying to Trump, "I can't do that, I will not do that." Because he will have a very, very clear idea of the law of war. So many civilians don't know the law of war very well, but every soldier, even if you've just been a war cadet, at some point very early on, you will learn about the law of war. You have to. It is set down in the Geneva Conventions that a military has to be trained in the law of war. And the United States follows these obligations. So some countries, clearly Israel doesn't do it very well because there are many violations of the law of war by their soldiers. And Russia, you get these, you also get the violations. I'll talk about that in a moment. But the United States, it is very, very careful in instructing in the law of war. So I'll talk later about why, even though Putin does break the law of war in numerous ways during his invasion, that he still has very strong restraints on what he's willing to do and what he can do. But first, let's look at the United States. So the 3 levels. If you just join as a war recruit, then at some point, pretty early on, you will be told the soldiers' rules. such for instance not to harm surrendering enemies, and collect and care for wounded, to attack medical personnel and so on. Destroy no more than the mission requires, and to treat humans and not to steal, treat civilians humanly and do their best to prevent law of war violations. They will be told already the basic principles of the law of war, even at level A, even though they are not themselves in command. Then level B, this is for an entire unit, and before the unit goes on combat duty, that will include a bombing mission like that B2 bombing of Iran, and every year as well. Then they need a judge advocate or a certified paralegal non-commissioned officer, so it's someone who knows the law of war thoroughly. They will teach them every year, refresh their memory. Then for officers, they get an officer level training, looking at the planning and execution of combat operations, not just if you're given a command to do something that's against the law of war, and how to report some best suspected violations of the law of war. Now, if you are a 4-star general, then you've gone through all of those, and you've had level B every year. You've probably been involved in teaching level B. You're probably involved in teaching level C as well. And then you'll have a team of lawyers that are expert in the topic at hand, just by your side at any operational call. If the president rings you up and says, "Look, I want to discuss bombing Moscow," then he will say, "Okay, I've got to get my legal advisor online for this. This is not something I can listen to without a legal advisor." So he'll say, "Just wait a minute, click, click. Now I've got my legal advisor, now we can talk about it." So he's not going to talk about that to the president without a legal advisor. And so this is what the text, this is the 5 basic principles as it is taught to soldiers by the International Red Cross and Crescent. And this is from a manual they can use for their teachers to teach soldiers as a resource. So they teach them that you're not free to do what you want, and utmost important that you understand these principles. You must always clearly distinguish between combatants and civilians, or the civilian population as such, and civilians are protected for attack. And you must always distinguish between military objectives which can be attacked and civilian objects which must be respected. You can only treat civilians, they only lose their protection if they participate in the hostilities for the time of their participation. So sometimes civilians will actually take part in the war themselves. If they do that, they lose that protection. Like, for instance, they were to throw petrol bombs at an advancing tank or something like that, and they'd lose their protection. Civilian and civil objects, they must be so. I know what I say. I have a little comment for each one. No, I didn't have one for that one. So yeah, so it's sometimes impossible to avoid harm to. For instance, when they attack the Kerch Bridge, but you have to make sure that any harm is not excessive compared to military gains. So, for instance, when they attacked the Kerch Bridge, then when the Ukrainians attacked the Kerch Bridge, they tried to do it at a time when there are very few civilians likely to be there, like early hours in the morning. And they do everything they can to minimize the risk to civilians, but sometimes it's impossible to make the risk zero. And so they must minimize it as much as possible. Then there has to be military necessity. So if you think about, order to attack Moscow, what's the military necessity for that behind that? How does he avoid harm to civilians? And that harm to civilians, that would include the risk to American civilians from Russia retaliating to it. So as a general, you have to look at the larger context of it, and he'd say to Trump, "Look, we need to understand the context of this. What is your overall objective? how are you going to protect American civilians if you attack Moscow? And if Trump hasn't got an answer to that, then again he'll say no, because he says, I can't see, there's too much risk to the American civilians. And there has to be military necessity. So what can he achieve by attacking Moscow that would stop Russia from, that would force Putin to a peace deal? What can he achieve in this way? But not just that. It's got to be something, it's got to be a military necessity. You can't say, well, look, I just want to scare Putin. That's not military necessity. It has to have a military objective that will stop the war. And they're prohibited if they are clearly unnecessary. And then there's also, this is mainly applies to soldiers, even enemy soldiers on the battlefield. Any harm to them has to be based on military necessity. So you can't be cruel to soldiers on the battlefield. You can't cause them unnecessary suffering. You can't do things that will torture them. And so that's another thing that's prevented. Now, hopefully you can see from that the general if a general was ordered by Trump, look, go and attack Moscow, or attack Putin, or attack and they can't target leaders of other countries either. That's a civilian. Putin is a civilian, and he's not a military general. I should add that there too, probably. So hopefully you can see from that there's no way that a general, any 4-star general, is going to be able to obey such an order from Trump. They would just say no, can't do that. And all this is done behind the scenes. This is not played out in public. It's not impossible that Trump has ordered a general to do something that is illegal. That is not wouldn't be too surprising. And the general would just say to him, no, I can't do that. And the general public would never get to hear about it. It might be revealed in archives, released several decades later. But this would just be it would be done and finished in private talks. So now let's look now at Putin. So I know Putin has broken, as I say there, I know Putin has broken many of those rules, but he still has limitations on what he does. And I think a very good example here is firebombing. This was legal during World War II. And the Allies, they did firebombing of Dresden, which was very much fun. A lot of people saying, look, that was not right, that was incorrect. But it wasn't against the law of war back at the time of World War II. And things like that continued through, you might wonder, everybody's heard of the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but how many have heard of the Tokyo firebombing? That was in 1945, and 100,000 Japanese civilians lost their lives in one raid on that one night, 9th to 10th of March 1945. That was actually more than died on the night of the Hiroshima bomb. So back then, and those were civilians, so back at the time in 1945, back then it was just accepted as part of the way that war was done, that you got firebombing. And things of significant large-scale harm to civilians continued all the way through to the Vietnam War. So during the Vietnam War, the United States did various things like that too. And it's only after that it was actually brought into international law that this must never happen again. And since then there've been nothing resembling a firebombing since the Vietnam War. So there have been situations like the siege of Mariupol, where it happened over several weeks, and they were cut off from the internet, cut off from food, cut off from water. There's been day by day there's been the bombing of Gaza Strip, where there are very high levels of civilian casualties over a period of time. The United States General would not be able to do either of those things. He would just refuse. But those countries are somewhat laxer in their application of the laws of war. Israel, because its lawyers have a different interpretation of the law of war, and Putin, just because he ignores it. But even neither of those countries have done firebombing. And they've never come anywhere close to that. So it could have made a huge difference to Russia. For instance, especially on the 24th of February. Suppose he'd done firebombing of Kharkiv, which nobody would ever do it today. But if this was the World War II, then he'd have done it. So this is just something that nobody would do today. So the firebombing of Kharkiv, then that would have been setting off fires throughout Kharkiv and killing most of its civilian population in order to take it over very quickly at the very start of the war. And that would have opened up the whole of the west of the transport routes, the rail and road routes from Kharkiv go throughout the western Ukraine. And that would have allowed Russia to advance very quickly with great surprise and a great deal of shock. Putin didn't even consider that. Well, you can't know what went through his mind, but certainly he never did anything even remotely like that. And since then, he sieged Kharkiv for quite a long time in the spring, all the way through to the fall of 2022, and he never even considered doing firebombing. He spent the entire winter of 2022-3 slowly taking Bakhmut, just a small city of about 70,000, very, very slowly. And he shelled it completely, bit by bit. But by the time he'd gone through it, there were just a few thousand people left there, living there. Civilians tend to live, even when they're being shelled around them, from 70,000, which is down to maybe 1,000 or so, by the time he eventually took it over. Surprisingly, civilians do often stay behind in cities, even in the ruins, even while shells are falling around them. That was about 1 in 70 in Bakhmut did that. So, but he didn't do a firebombing, which could have taken over Bakhmut very quickly at very huge cost of life to the civilians. So, and then Avdiivka, which was a much smaller city, and he took months to take that. And then liberating Sudzha, which was a very small city of 5,000, which was his objective of 24-5, the one that was taken by the Ukraine the previous summer. And you can see also how Russia's objectives have got less and less. Each year, the objective has been far smaller. In the fall of 2022, Ukraine liberated Kherson, which was 250,000. In winter and the difficulty of liberating or taking a city is roughly proportional to the population, because it depends on the number of streets for street-to-street fighting. So it was 70,000 for the winter of 22-3 for Russia. It was only about, I think, 5,000 for Avdiivka in 23-4. It was only, no, it was a bit more than that. I forget the number for Avdiivka. And then it was only 5,000 for Sudzha. It was in between the two. And 5,000 for Sudzha in 24-5. So each year it's got less and less what Russia has managed to achieve. And it's pretty much at a standstill now. And never, not once, in all that time has Putin done firebombing. And using nukes would be far, far more serious than doing firebombing, just for the symbolic reason. Even if it didn't harm any civilians. So this is just showing how Putin, he pretends to be angry. He acts angry sometimes, maybe. I don't even see it. He seems to me to just have a constant slight smile on his face. I don't really see why people think that he looks as if he is someone who easily loses his control and and gets on temper. He doesn't seem to me to have anything of that in his nature that he displays. He doesn't even act being someone who is emotionally out of control. He just uses words. He managed to convince people just using words without even being in any way in his behaviour emotionally out of control. I don't get it at all. I'm not affected at all by whatever it is that Putin managed to do to convince other people that he's emotionally unstable. I don't see it. I don't understand. And he certainly isn't. So that's about Putin. And then so let's look at now this false claim that by Musk that Trump is in the Epstein files. So to start a war with Russia would be far more damaging to his base than this non-existent Epstein client list. So what has happened here is that Trump was boosting the conspiracy claim that the Epstein files have evidence of high-ups in the Democrat Party being in some way involved as pedophiles. And that's been things he's been saying all along. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. And so he promised that he would unearth this evidence when he became president. Finally, he released Epstein files, and all it found was that he committed suicide. He wasn't murdered by some high-up Democrat or anything. And the evidence is pretty clear that he committed suicide. And Musk then said, look, Trump is in the Epstein files, and there's an Epstein client list. And that's why they've not been made public. He was not doing this based on knowing about the existence of such a list. It was just him he just fires off random things like this from time to time to try to discomfort people, not based on anything. And the FBI and the Department of Justice, they have found they had no such so-called client list. And Musk gave no evidence. He's just stirring up, and this is from Politico, where pretty good at this sort of thing. They just say that no one understands better than Elon Musk how to stir up trouble with MAGA and the MAGA base. And so, remember I talked about this before, not based on my own ideas, because the reliable sources that I was following were talking about it, and they were saying, look, this friendliness between Musk and Trump is not going to last. They're both bigger than life characters. There's going to be a split up. And indeed there was. And this is it. And it's going to cause endless trouble for Trump going forward, because Musk has been an insider with MAGA, and he knows exactly how to cause trouble in the MAGA party. And it probably cause significant issues for Trump going into the next election, the midterms, and the special elections and so on. So this is Musk just doing that, just stirring up trouble. So indeed, Trump does have problems with Musk. That is absolutely correct. What is incorrect is linking this all together and saying that, and Trump does distract. There's no doubt about that either. He often does various things to distract. I mean, some people say that this whole thing about going into to New York, you sending the military there, was just to distract. Not New York, sorry, to San Francisco and all that stuff, and Gavin Newsom and all that stuff. And he has many ways to distract, but nobody is suggesting that he's even trying to distract for the Epstein files. This is not in the news. I can't find anyone, never mind the conspiracy theory, that he'd start a new war to try to distract from this. It looks as if he's just going to kind of last it out as the way things are going, because if he was going to distract, he'd have done it June the 5th, or he'd have done it around July the 7th, possible if you go and look at those dates, you'll find things that you could say were something to do with distracting. But he'd do it then. He wouldn't just postpone it and say, well, look, I'm going to announce the distraction from the Epstein files 3 days from now. That's not how you distract. So no. So now, then this is the journalist test. For any of these things you see on the internet, remember that any journalist with Associated Press, New York Times, BBC, NPR, Politico, and so on, see the same things you see. And I've shared, for instance, what Politico said about the whole Epstein thing. There's nothing in that story from Politico about saying, look, Trump is going to start a war, distract away from Epstein. It makes no sense. It's just impossible. And so think about this. If what these people are gossiping about online is true, and it's just a small number of people who gossip like that, I haven't been asked many questions about it, then remember, any journalist can go and look at them. Someone like you who's got panicked by it could ring up a journalist and say, look, I saw these people gossiping on Reddit, go and check them out. Why don't you run a story about it in headline news? And if you try that, the journalist is just going to ignore you. Because they might visit the forum, but they'll just say, look, there's just random people on the internet. There are always people saying things like that. And anyway, so you can see that if it isn't even in the new mainstream news, and if it should be the top story of the day, if true, then that's an easy way to dismiss many of the most falsely scary things that we are asked to debunk. Most of the most scary seeming things are never even in the mainstream news, because a journalist will just take one look and say, look, that's not a reliable source, it makes utterly no sense, we can't run that story. And this is an example. And so now I'm just going to talk about this, about how Trump's pivot is going to help to end the war sooner. So he uses bluffs to get allies to stop supporting Ukraine, so he can cultivate this image he's attacked out of a moment of madness. But if you go and look at it carefully, this is just what I was explaining in the intro. He only invaded because he was sure. And so, I didn't really explain so much in the interview. Trump was sure that he would win in 2 weeks when he invaded Ukraine. He was so sure he didn't even have plan B. So all the invasion from many different directions, all out war, was just a distraction. His real aim was to send a small detachment to fly to Hostomel Airport to take some tanks and drive into the Kiev, and while the government was distracted and trying to fight this war in all directions to take over the government. And then he thought the war would end in about 2 weeks after that. He got very rosy-tinted claims. So Putin was very careful for, as I say, he spent the entire summer, spring to summer of 2021, preparing for this in meticulous detail. But he never told his generals, because he worried that they would leak it. Only his Gerasimov, who's just a kind of yes-man, well, not really a yes-man, he would have his limits, but someone who just generally does is always Putin's ally on everything. And none of the people he ran it past, he didn't run it past anyone who would look at it with a critical eye. And so that's why he missed the possibility that this plan would fail, which it did. He didn't manage to establish an air bridge to Hostomel until far too late. The Ukrainians had been sent Stinger air missiles from Lithuania and Latvia. The aim was for helicopters to fly along the river to Hostomel Airport, but some got shot down, and he just cancelled the whole thing after that. And so that was his mistake. So he was extremely risk averse. He made a mistake. And that's it. He could not make such a mistake with NATO. So there's no support for him taking major risks that would with virtual certainty spell disaster for his regime. And you've got to remember that for Putin, what matters is the future of his regime. It's not about the personal lives of soldiers on the front line. What Putin considers to be a great risk is if there's a risk to himself or his family, of course, or there's a risk to his regime staying in power in Moscow, a military risk. And so there's no support. And then Putin can very easily end this war. So giving Ukraine an advantage over Russia does not mean that Russia will advance more easily in Ukraine. It means that Russia will be prevented from advancing in Ukraine. And that's the way to end the war sooner, because for as long as Russia is advancing, then Putin has a motivation to keep the war going. Even if he's only going to claim a few more square miles, he can then run this as a big story on TASS. Every time he wins a new village, even if it's just a couple of houses, he'll run this as headline news on TASS, saying, look, our army has valiantly taken over 2 houses in the middle of a field in Donetsk. And he won't actually say there's only 2 houses in the middle of a field, but he will say it's taken over the strategic settlement of XYZ, which, if you go and look it up, is just a few houses in a field. But he relies on the readers not bothering to look it up. So as long as he's being able to make very small advances like that, he's got the motive to keep going. For as soon as he stops being able to do any advances, and especially if he starts losing big time, then he's got the motive to start thinking about peace. That is the dynamic of this war. And I follow experts on Twitter, so I get a little bit of an inside look at what they say to each other. And they never talk about the risk of a world war, not between themselves. And they often talk about how it's so strange that it takes so long and so late for Ukraine's allies to help them to stop Russia from advancing and to help them. So if you could go back to 2022, say the fall of 2022, after they just liberated Kherson, or if you go back earlier to the spring before Russia took Mariupol, if you could go back then and give Ukraine just a fraction of what it has now, Russia could never have taken Mariupol. If all Ukraine would have needed would be a few Patriot air defense systems, that would be enough to protect up Mariupol and make it utterly impossible for Russia to take it over. So the very simple things that Ukraine has today, that if they could be sent back in a time machine to spring 2024, the war would have been over within a few weeks. There are other things that Ukraine's allies have never given to it that would enable, but just like you remember in Syria, in Iran, the way that Israel, with the F-16s, which are more advanced than the very ancient Iranian fighters, they took over the entire Iranian airspace in just the first day. Well, in the same way, if Ukraine had the F-35s, which are as advanced over the best Russian fighters as the F-16s are over those ancient Iranian fighters, then Ukraine could take over the entire airspace have complete air control over occupied Ukraine and some area, part of the border with Russia as well, around it, probably in the first day. So this is why Russia attacked. This is why Russia attacked Ukraine, and in February 2022, and why it didn't attack the far weaker Estonia. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, between the three of them, don't have a single tank. They don't have a single infantry fighting vehicle. They don't have a single fighter jet. They have some trainer aircraft and some transport aircraft, just a handful of those. and they have some guns and things, but they don't have those basic things which Ukraine had hundreds of or more at the start of and it had even had very, very large numbers of fighter jets, a tenth of the Russian numbers, but Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia had none of those. And the reason Russia invaded Ukraine and didn't invade any of those three countries because they're part of NATO. And they have a contingent of 1,000 or so British soldiers there and several other NATO contingents in their countries. They have an air base in Lithuania from which fighter jets do air patrols over the Baltic states. And if Russia was to start building up an invasion army outside of those three countries, then NATO countries would build up a defending army inside of them. And there's just no way that Russia could even have considered invading Ukraine, the Baltic states then or now. It's completely impossible. And so long as NATO stays together and stays strong, which it is doing. And so and especially that's been very clear, especially since the Ukraine war, when it became very clear that Russia couldn't achieve air control over Ukraine, when in a similar situation as we saw with Iran, then Israel was able to take air control over the entire area of Iran in just the first day. Russia was not able to take air control over Ukraine, even with 10 times as many fighter jets, and with fighter jets that, even though Ukraine's weren't as old as the Iranian ones, the Russian ones were significantly advanced over what Ukraine had back then, which was mainly left over from when Ukraine left the Soviet Union in the 1990s. So Russia is not trained in taking over air control. It's never had to do that. So it's partly a lack of training and partly because their planes aren't as good as the NATO ones. And so in a fight between Russia and NATO, if there ever was one, NATO would have air control straight away. Russia would not be able to do anything except to get out of the way as quickly as possible, much like the Iranians did. So these sanctions and air defences and weapons for Ukraine, they will protect the civilians from the Russian drones, protect Russia from advancing on the front line. They'll let it destroy military defensive targets in Russia and destroy demand supply routes to the front line. Nowadays, like Germany is helping Ukraine to be able to develop its own missiles, which it will in turn use to destroy those supply lines. And as we approach 2026, if the war continues all the way from now to 2026, then Russia may start to run out of its Soviet-era armoured vehicles. And when that happens, then Ukraine will have a distinct advantage over Russia all along its front line. And if Ukraine has also managed to block the supply routes to the front line, and it is very, very difficult for Russia because they're around the outside and there are loads and loads of small rivers in the part of Ukraine that Russia has got control of, in Crimea and in eastern Donbass, and especially along the Azov Sea coast. There's loads and loads of very small rivers, but big enough to need bridges. And this means it's very dependent on the bridges, and it would replace them by pontoon bridges. They're big enough so tanks can't just drive straight over them. And so they have to have bridges or pontoon bridges. And there are loads and loads of them. Not just the Kerch Bridge. Dozens and dozens of bridges. And so if Ukraine gets to the point where it can significantly damage bridges from a distance, that's why they're so interested in German tourists, but they can develop their own capability. And that's an example that this would significantly damage the ability of the Russians. And the Ukrainians are not vulnerable in the same way. They've got a much more compact region to defend. The Russian attackers are not nearly so precise either. So it is possible that it ends. So it is possible that it ends through these levers sometime over the next few weeks, 2 months. It's also possible that this doesn't work. And so these levers, the sanctions, the secondary sanctions, if they do work, they could stop all Russian oil sales to India and gas, even gas sales to China. They might even stop that. But Russia would then have to raise about 3.5%, add 3.5% tax per citizen throughout the entire Russia. And Ukraine has increased its military tax by 3.5% in December. So for a country that was actually really very, very serious about this war, or wanted to defend itself, then 3.5% is the amount they can find. But the issue here is that for Russia, this is not nearly so important a war as it is for Ukraine. It just labels it as a special operation. Putin could stop this war tomorrow, and nobody in Russia would really pay that much attention, really. They'd say, oh, look, and they just believe whatever Putin says. Putin would say, look, I've accomplished all the objectives, just like he did in Syria. So in Syria, Putin lost the only airbase they had in the Mediterranean, outside the former Soviet Union, the only seaport they had, and he just told the Russian people everything that we set out to accomplish in Syria has been achieved. And that's all he said. And then he just abandoned it without even mentioning what he'd done. That is how Putin would end the war in Ukraine. He would simply tell the Russian people, we have now achieved everything we aimed to do there, and if necessary he'd abandon Crimea as well, if he needed to, if that's how it ends. So don't think that that Russia is stuck in a corner. It isn't. Putin can easily end this war. He just needs to declare to the Russian people that he has won. That's how it works in Russia, because he has such complete control of Russian propaganda. So all this so what Trump's pivot to sanction Russia and support Ukraine, that's a way to end the war sooner, but it depends then on Putin and whether he thinks that the ability to keep it advancing maybe for another few square miles and claiming an occasional village from time to time is of more value for his regime in Russia, and is of enough value for it to be worth adding a military tax of 3.5% to the incomes throughout Russia. If he thinks it's worth it, he'll do it. If he thinks it isn't worth it, then he'll end the war. So that's how it ends up being a kind of, it's just a lever. It's not a guarantee that Putin will stop. It's just a lever that might lead to Putin stopping, based on he is not concerned at all about the loss of Russian lives. That doesn't seem to be in his calculus at all, of Russian military soldiers' lives. He cares a lot about things like taxing Russian civilians. He cares a lot about his base even though he's a dictator, he cares a lot about, and he do frequent polling in Russia to try and find out what people think of the latest things that the government is doing. So he does care about what his base thinks. So he does care about the impact of things like taxes and the economy, and so that's the sort of thing that Putin thinks about. It's very, very different from the way people think he thinks in the West. It's not about getting angry. He doesn't even really that very interested in the war in a way. It's more that he just thinks that this will give him an advantage over Ukraine, give him a bit of an advantage over NATO in some way. He thinks it's a political thing that will help him in his Kremlin inter-Kremlin rivalries and so on. And if that calculus changes, then just as with Syria, he will just withdraw from Ukraine and that's it over. So there's no support whatsoever from taking major risks that would with virtual certainty spell disaster for his regime. That is just not the sort of person Putin is. So anyway, I hope hopefully this helps, and I'll now upload this to my YouTube channel, and maybe I should do a shorter one to